The new Pokemon game came out a few days ago, and it reminded me of an old clip from the Game Grumps while they were playing The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening.
Pokemon just, well, not just, but like recently announced a Diamond and Pearl remake, and it's like kind of this aesthetic, but it looks like
Huh.
it looks terrible.
Why?
I don't know!
Okay,
That's
geez,
the question.
easy,
I don't know
take it
why!
easy,
Here's the thing. Zelda, not even like, it's like it's pretty popular franchise, right? Like everyone knows Zelda.
Yeah.
It's not the most popular franchise in the world. Do you know what is?
Pokemon.
Pokemon!
Yeah, that is weird.
It is the most successful franchise of all time, and all of their games look like
It's so weird. Sun and Moon look good.
but it's on the Switch now, and the Switch had Breath of the Wild, it's got Monster Hunter Rise, it's got some beautiful ass games on it, it's got Link's Awakening!
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
And all the Pokemon games that they've announced, Pokemon Arceus and Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Remake, they look like shit! It troubles me so, because I like Pokemon, I like the idea of Pokemon.
Isn't Nintendo super careful about their properties looking awesome?
Exactly! All of their games look great! They always push the system to their limits because every one of their systems is underpowered. The Switch is like a horribly underpowered system, but that's because it's portable. And so they make their games look great despite that.
This place looks nice.
It does, I would live here. This look, it's beautiful! There's so much flavor and all the art is unique. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Pokemon looks like garbage.
I remembered this clip and I thought, you know, he does have a point. Why does Pokemon not look better than it should? Now, I'm not just talking about the newest entry, Legends Z either. Why has Pokemon, during its entire lifespan on Switch, looked so mediocre, especially compared to every other major game on the console? They're the largest media franchise on the planet, the fourth biggest game franchise behind Mario, the many variations of Tetris, and Call of Duty. They visually pale in comparison to every other game on the platform. I want to talk about what I want from Pokemon. I'm going to make this part very clear. I don't hate Pokemon. Just because you point out the flaws in something doesn't mean that you don't care about it, much less actively despise it. I like Pokemon. My first generation was Gen 6. I remember getting beat by the water guy in the Elite Four. I got so worried about fighting him that I went and started grinding on Victory Road. God, I had to have spent weeks grinding Charizard to level 100, and once I did, I cleared the entire Elite Four and Champion with only that one Charizard. I played and beat every mainline Pokemon game released for the 3DS, and I enjoyed almost every second. I did not like blacking out in those games. It took me a long time to get a Switch, but when I did, I sure did play a bunch of Mario. Yeah, I didn't get around to playing Pokemon on Switch until 2021. None of the new games were as compelling as those older titles, and we are going to focus on the Switch because of this. Prior to the Switch, Pokemon was a handheld franchise. Joyce gave it some excuse. Even if you thought the games were unimpressive or wanted voice acting in those games, the hardware wasn't that powerful. The series had been sprite-based all the way to Gen 5. When Gen 6 came around, the low resolution didn't matter because the novelty. For the first time in the series' 17-year history up to this point, Pokemon was now 3D, and portable at the same time. Moving forward from X and Y, the games on 3DS gradually improved graphically with each oncoming entry. Despite the game being on a 3DS, Gen 7 looked great for a game on the handheld. Arguably, some of the best looking games on the 3DS are Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. It wasn't until the shift to the Switch that visuals became a serious problem. The reason this is a problem is because now the inherent expectation of visuals have increased dramatically. We are going from a handheld displaying games on the same level as a PS2, not an insult, just a fact, to a hybrid console that can now display in HD. To boot, this new hybrid console has launched with a new Zelda game that looks incredible, along with a new Mario and a new Xenoblade, both of which are the best those respective franchises have ever looked. Pokemon needed, no pun intended, to evolve, and it needed to do so at an unnaturally fast pace. Eventually, we got a Pokemon game on the Switch, and it looked good. Surprisingly good. However, I'm not talking about Sword and Shield, but the last games to be part of Generation 7. The Let's Go games. Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee took the series and brought it to the Switch with bright, vibrant, simple, and downright inviting visuals. This is what I imagine when Pokemon is brought up. Colorful creatures, simple looking yet effective character designs, and a world that, while not very immersive, was still incredibly appealing. The only real problem with the style was its Cantonian inspiration. As while the world looks great, it does still have the layout of a late 90s Game Boy game. This game is what I believe to be a perfect entry point for newcomers, though many longtime fans do find the game to be a bit too simple and handholdy. But besides that, the next games would be Generation 8, the first real mainline Pokemon games on the Switch. The entire community was excited for these. And then we saw the game, and this is where the majority of complaints towards Pokemon's visuals started to really stem from. Where Let's Go went for a vibrant and simple style, Sword and Shield went for a greater emphasis on realism. I still don't get this choice. So, style versus realism, alright? For Pokemon, it's weird, because on one hand, the game is going for a much larger open exploration-based structure with each new entry, and that realism, if executed properly, can enhance the overall gameplay experience. On the other hand, Pokemon has always had an anime aesthetic. Even if the older games or Game Boy games, they still had sprites that were somewhat drawn in that anime style. The idea of that realism contrasts the core visual identity of these games. What's worse is when many aspects of this realism fail outright because of how they were made in general. That's another big issue all these games Gen 8 and beyond have. They have prioritized designs to a fault. Some places, mainly ones that are made as set pieces or places integral to the story, are done exceptionally well, emphasizing exceptionally, because when you decide to look around at these places and actually explore them, you realize how they either look depressing or barren, especially when compared to those major locations. A big counterpoint people often use to disprove the decline in Pokemon's overall visual quality are the in-game character designs, which a majority of them look great. They've continuously improved with each generation, I will agree on that. But the problem is that, like the world, they are priority designs. A lot of the side characters just sort of stand around not really doing anything, most of them in fixed A poses, which are obviously used for their modeling. Like the world, it's not a huge problem, and it's not inherently noticeable unless you actually start looking around the world and at the finer details within it. Yeah, sorry if it feels like we're taking a long time here with Sword and Shield, which, while they do carry a lot of my gripes with the overall modern design of Pokemon, they are definitely not the worst offenders. So I did want to take one last second to show off some of the decent designs for Pokemon, like Dreadnought or Alchemy, which are pretty good, and some of the other ones, like Arrokuda and Sandaconda, which are designs I find either boring in comparison to older Pokemon or just unappealing. Which in general is a gripe I have more so with newer games, because as we keep going further away from the original games, we also get further away from the original style those games had. With each new generation, Pokemon have sort of become less cohesive overall. Like, just compare Pokemon from the first 2 or 3 generations with anything from Gen 9, and they just aren't comparable. Of course, this is mostly subjective, but it is still very apparent that there is a departure from the original design Pokemon used to have. For many longtime players, that is extremely off-putting. Flamigo sucks. Anyway, I'm getting stuck up here. Let's move on to the next games. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. How? You went back and you already had games simpler, but you... Why? Why did they do this? Why? How does this feel like such a step backwards, despite the fact that the style has been simplified to be overall easier to work with? Even if it wasn't designed in the same style as the Let's Go games, those Let's Go games still looked far more vibrant and colorful. Link's Awakening, a game that released years earlier with a kind of similar style, looks leagues better. 2 years after this game, we got Super Mario RPG, a game that used a style even closer to these Pokemon games, and it still looked better. Why does this game look the way it does? I guess it doesn't matter, because despite being panned for its low-quality visuals and its lack of new additions, it still sold 15 million copies. This game is the 15th best-selling game on the Switch, and it looks like this. For comparison, those two games I mentioned, Link's Awakening and Super Mario RPG, only sold 6 million and 3 million copies respectively. This game performed incredibly well despite its very apparent quality, and you can't make an argument of visuals don't matter because it's a remake. The point of a remake is not just to make the game accessible for new players, but to enhance the experience, make it better than you remembered it being. It doesn't change much in gameplay, and so it needs that visual point, but instead, no, it's a mediocre cash grab of a game that sold 15 million copies. After that came Legends Arceus, one of the most ambitious Pokemon games yet, and on top of that, it was one of the biggest Pokemon games this system had had so far. The visuals, however, still weren't that great. I think this game cemented my issues with modern Pokemon. It has to look realistic enough to sort of immerse, but at the same time, it has to fit the overall anime aesthetic of all the characters and Pokemon in the world. And it just doesn't work very well at all. However, this entry introduced a new big problem, with Pokemon being lacking in optimization. While not terrible, there is more noticeable lag than any of the past games before, but this was still forgivable as the overall ambition of the world was really huge. This game actually wound up being pretty good. I'd actually argue that it's one of the best Pokemon games on this console. This wouldn't be nearly as forgivable with the next entry, however. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, or Gen 9, would try to scale even further, with a greater open world than any mainline Pokemon up to this point. This game, though, would be the first time in the history of Pokemon for a game to launch in a horrific state. Game crashes, constant pop-in, new glitches by the day, and the worst optimization of a first-party Nintendo game ever up to this point, with comparisons reaching Fallout 76 levels of embarrassment. This was the worst Pokemon game that had released up to this point, and yet it still had a fan base playing damage control, saying that the game, despite its very apparent technical issues, despite its visual flaws, despite all of its issues, it's still a good game at its core, and it also has an engaging story alongside that fun gameplay. Which, I gotta be honest, what story? The plot in Pokemon overall has virtually been the same since Gen 3. You play as an up-and-coming Pokemon trainer whose goal is to beat multiple professional trainers and eventually become champion. Though at some point around the 3/4 or endgame, an antagonistic group who has been a background focus comes in, and that confrontation with that background group winds up leading to a battle with a giant entity like Pokemon who in most cases is the in-game legendary. They only differ really through the way that Gen 8 tries to mix it up by making the true villains a different antagonistic group than the main one. Arceus kinda just does the trope, except you are literally the one sent from God. Gen 9 segments the trope amongst multiple stories, and ZA has you work with what should be the villain team. Yeah, they are stories, although most of the big stories that people bring up are through the major side characters, but even then, that's kind of a stretch to the fact that it's side content. Fact is, most people don't even really play Pokemon for the story itself. They play Pokemon for Pokemon, the interesting creatures that kind of always have been the selling point of the franchise. My problem, which is pretty much the summary of the entire video, is the fact that the world I have to explore in order to find those Pokemon often looks like Paldea. And a majority of the fandom, even those who admit they love this game, still admit this is probably the least interesting looking region of Pokemon we have ever seen. It also became the best-selling Pokemon game on the Switch, despite this backlash. How? How's a game this poorly made? How's this game that has this graphical quality, how does it still maintain this level of popularity? How is it that a standard upgrade from Switch 1 to 2 has completely flipped the public perception of this mess of a game? How did this become acceptable? How did this become the standard of what a Pokemon game is? This brings us to our current entry, ZA. And yeah, it's the culmination of everything I've talked about so far. Design priorities hurting the bigger picture of the game, poor optimization, and world that overall is lackluster and kind of unattractive. This game also drastically scaled back, with the entire map being one that you can cross in literally 2 minutes, with all of its pop-in and JPEG walls being visible to see, showing not just what the game is, but also what it's not. One of the funny thing is about Kalos is based on France. The city you explore in ZA, this is supposed to be Paris. This game is based on Paris, France, and it looks like this. The thing is, while I am trying to rip these games apart, it would be extremely ignorant to say that these games are failures. Pokemon is a series that is more so about the characters that you meet and the Pokemon you find. As time has gone on, both have had very obvious quality of life improvements. I think the characters look good. I think most Pokemon look good. My problem and overarching thing I've tried to look at in this video, again, is the world I have to explore in order to find said Pokemon. You see, when a game is an RPG with an explorable world, I feel the need to explore that world. And if that world is lacking in detail, and that world has technical issues such as pop-in, when the world is not impressive, I feel disappointed. And that is how I can summarize my feelings towards modern Pokemon. Not a hatred or despise, but disappointed at what it is. And no, just because I want it to look better does not mean that I want realism. It means that I want it to look better. I want it to look smooth, vibrant, and inviting. I want it to embrace its identity as a video game alongside its anime roots. I want Pokemon to evolve into something, not into something adult, but something that I can show my kids someday. I want to show them what I enjoyed about those games and let them see for themselves why I enjoyed those games when I was their age. Pokemon is having an identity crisis. It should not be shielded from all criticism, because how do we expect it to grow past this when we keep feeding into them? This doesn't mean boycott the Pokemon company. It doesn't mean you should be thought less of for still wanting these new games or even enjoying them, but let's not pretend. As I said before, Pokemon is the biggest media franchise on the planet, the fourth best-selling game franchise, with the games in 5th and 6th being GTA and Minecraft. We should expect more. It is unreasonable for these games to be budgeted the way they are, with none of the Pokemon games I mentioned having a budget over 25 million, despite each gen, remake, or Legends game selling over 10 million copies each. To understand this better, I created a break-even equation for Legend of ZA's budget. So let's try to be as nice as we possibly can here. The game at its base, without the Switch 2 edition or the DLC, is $60. Retailers are said to take somewhere around 20% of the game's profit, if not less. So we'll use 20% anyway. 20% of 60 is 12. It also costs $15 to manufacture the cartridge for the physical copy of the game. So 12 plus 15, 27. So $60 for the game minus external costs, $33 per cart. ZA's budget was $13 million, not counting the marketing. So 13 million divided by 33 is an estimate of 393,000 copies to break even. Keep in mind, that's the worst case scenario, considering how most people will buy the game digitally, removing the retail costs and the cart manufacturing costs. Also, the fact that most people will likely buy that Switch 2 version and probably the DLC as well, in which case, they only really have to sell around 185,000 copies. This game has already sold 2.9 million units. Yeah, Poor Pokemon. This is entirely done out of greed, simply because they know they can get away with it. They don't actually have to budget the games or make them look as good, because they know it'll sell anyway. How long until this mentality reaches the character designs of Pokemon, or even the core of the gameplay itself? The thing is, we already know that this issue will not improve. Generation 10 has had its budget leaked, and when you know it, it's 20 million, which is surprisingly lower than Generation 9, yet it's coming out on newer hardware. They clearly don't care about these games. And they're not going to change because they know what they're doing is working anyway. Why put more effort in for potentially more sales or improve for greater reception? And they can just choose the safest possible option every time with no risk whatsoever. And it genuinely bugs me how many people feel the need to defend this even when taking everything I've said into consideration. You can say things like, visuals don't matter as long as the gameplay is fun, which is true, except for the fact that I've played Mario, I've played Zelda, I've played Kirby, I've played Donkey Kong, I've played Pikmin, I've played Metroid, and all of those games look better. And all of these games prioritize gameplay over anything else. And the thing is, about that last one I mentioned, Metroid, it hasn't had a single entry sell over 4 million units. Metroid Prime 4 is releasing in December, a game in a long-running series that, comparative to Pokemon, has been living on scraps, and yet somehow the newest game not only looks great, it's said to be Nintendo's most expensive game yet. More expensive than Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And we don't even have to use the newest game as a comparison. Both Metroid Dread and the Metroid Prime Remaster both look incredible, because like Aaron from Game Grumps said in the beginning, Nintendo usually strives to make their games look good in spite of the hardware they use. And they either refuse to give Game Freak the means necessary, or Game Freak's higher-ups don't understand why they need to improve when it sells the way it does anyway. Want to hear the one last funny thing? The age of the average Pokemon player is 32. Pokemon is not appealing to kids today half as much as they should be. The core audience of Pokemon is officially 4 times older than the intended audience. I want to like Pokemon, but this should not be acceptable for a game demanding $70, not including the cost for the $30 expansion, which all these past games have also had $30 expansions. Pokemon is now seen as simply just an under-budget, overpriced franchise fueled only by player nostalgia. I'm serious, I genuinely want to like these games. Those older titles are some of my favorite games I ever played. X and Y were genuinely my favorite games on the 3DS. I liked them more than any of the Mario games I ever played on it, more than any Zelda game you could ever show me. I loved those classic Pokemon games. I loved Pokemon X and Y. I seriously enjoyed Pokemon Sun. I played Ultra Moon all the way through. Pokemon is one of my favorite franchises, but I'm not going to keep supporting these games if they don't even seem to want to put effort into them anymore. If they don't care about these games, why should we? Especially whenever they have a new game coming out that actually looks good. I'm serious. This new game looks beautiful. Why can't Pokemon... Why can't Pokemon look good? Anyway, if you like my content, like and subscribe. I should be playing... I'm actually in the middle of playing Let's Go right now. If you want to hop over on Twitch and check that out. See you some other time, I guess.